The land of Israel is one of several names for an area of indefinite geographical extension in the southern Levant. Related biblical, religious and historical English terms include the land of Canaan, the Promised Land, the Holy Land, and Palestine. The definitions of the limits of this territory vary between passages in the Hebrew Bible, with specific mentions in Genesis chapter 15, Exodus chapter 23, Numbers chapter 34 and Ezekiel chapter 47. 9 times elsewhere in the Bible, the settled land is referred as, from Dan to Beersheba, and 3 times it is referred as, from the entrance of Hamath unto the brook of Egypt. These biblical limits for the land differ from the borders of established historical Israelite and later Jewish kingdoms. Over time these have included the United Kingdom of Israel, the 2 separated kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the Hasmonean kingdom, and the Herodian kingdom, which at their heights ruled lands with similar, but not identical boundaries. The Jewish religious belief that the area is a God-given inheritance of the Jewish people is based on the Torah, particularly in the books of Genesis and Exodus, as well as in the later prophets. According to the book of Genesis, the land was first promised by God to the descendants of Abram. The text is explicit that this is a covenant between God and Abram for his descendants. Abram's name was later changed to Abraham, with the promise refined to pass through his son Isaac and to the Israelites, descendants of Jacob, Abraham's grandson. This belief is not shared by most adherents of replacement theology, who hold the view that the Old Testament prophecies were superseded by the coming of Jesus, a view often repudiated by Christian Zionists as a theological error. Evangelical Zionists variously claim that Israel has title to the land by divine right, or by a theological, historical and moral grounding of attachment to the land unique to Judaism. The idea that ancient religious texts can be warrant or divine right for a modern claim has often been challenged, and Israeli courts have rejected land claims based on religious motivations. During the mandatory period, the term Eretz Yisrael, or the Land of Israel, was part of the official Hebrew name of mandatory Palestine. Official Hebrew documents used the Hebrew transliteration of the word Palestine, followed always by the 2 initial letters of Eretz Yisrael, Aleph Yod. The Land of Israel concept has been evoked by the founders of the State of Israel. It often surfaces in political debates on the status of the West Bank, which is referred to in official Israeli discourse as Judea and Samaria, from the names of the 2 historical Jewish kingdoms. Etymology and biblical roots. The term, Land of Israel, is a direct translation of the Hebrew phrase, which occurs occasionally in the Bible, and is first mentioned in the Tanakh at 1 Samuel chapter 13 verse 19, following the Exodus when the Israelite tribes were already in the land of Canaan. The words are used sparsely in the Bible. King David is ordered to gather strangers to the land of Israel for building purposes, and the same phrasing is used as reference to King Solomon's census of all of the strangers in the land of Israel. Ezekiel, though generally preferring the phrase soil of Israel, employs Eretz Israel twice, respectively at Ezekiel 40-2 and Ezekiel 47-18. According to Martin Noth, the term is not an authentic and original name for this land, but instead serves as a somewhat flexible description of the area which the Israelite tribes had their settlements. According to B'Anita Shapira, the term Eretz Yisrael was a holy term, vague as far as the exact boundaries of the territories are concerned but clearly defining ownership. The sanctity of the land developed rich associations in rabbinical thought, where it assumes a highly symbolic and mythological status infused with promise, though always connected to a geographical location. Nur Masala argues that the biblical boundaries are entirely fictitious, and bore simply religious connotations in diaspora Judaism, with the term only coming into ascendancy with the rise of Zionism. The Hebrew Bible provides 3 specific sets of borders for the Promised Land, each with a different purpose. Neither of the terms, Promised Land, or Land of Israel, are used in these passages. Genesis chapter 15 verses 13 to 21, Genesis chapter 17 verse 8 and Ezekiel chapter 47 verses 13 to 20 use the term, the land, as does Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 8 in which it is promised explicitly to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and to their descendants after them, whilst Numbers chapter 34 verses 1 to 15 describes the land of Canaan, which is allocated to 9.5 of the 12 Israelite tribes after the Exodus. The expression, Land of Israel, is first used in a later book, 1 Samuel chapter 13 verse 19. It is defined in detail in the exilic book of Ezekiel as a land where both the 12 tribes and the strangers in midst can claim inheritance. The name Israel first appears in the Hebrew Bible as the name given by God to the patriarch Jacob, deriving from the name of Israel. Other designations that came to be associated with the Jewish people have included the children of Israel, or Israelite. The term, Land of Israel, occurs in one episode in the New Testament, where, according to Shlomo Sand, it bears the unusual sense of the area surrounding Jerusalem. The section in which it appears was written as a parallel to the earlier book of Exodus. Biblical interpretations of the borders. Genesis chapter 15 verses 18 to 21 describes what are known as borders of the land, which in Jewish tradition, defines the extent of the land promised to the descendants of Abraham, through his son Isaac and grandson Jacob. The passage describes the area as the land of the 10 named ancient peoples then living there. More precise geographical borders are given Exodus chapter 23 verse 31, which describes borders as marked by the Red Sea, the Sea of the Philistines, i.e., the Mediterranean, and the river, the Euphrates, the traditional furthest extent of the Kingdom of David. Genesis gives the border with Egypt as Nahar Mitzrayim. Nahar in Hebrew denotes a large river, never a wadi. Exodus chapter 23. A slightly more detailed definition is given in Exodus chapter 23 verse 31, which describes the borders as, from the Sea of Reds to the Sea of the Philistines and from the desert to the Euphrates River. Though the Hebrew text of the Bible uses the name of the river to refer to the Euphrates, only the Red Sea and the Euphrates are mentioned to define the southern and eastern borders of the full land promised to the Israelites. The Red Sea, corresponding to Hebrew Yam Suf, was understood in ancient times to be the Erythraean Sea, as reflected in the Septuagint translation. Although the English name, Red Sea, is derived from this name, the term denoted all the waters surrounding Arabia, including the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf, not merely the sea lying to the west of Arabia bearing this name in modern English. Thus the entire Arabian Peninsula lies within the borders described. Modern maps depicting the region take a reticent view and often leave the southern and eastern borders vaguely defined. The borders of the land to be conquered given in Numbers have a precisely defined eastern border which included the Arabah and Jordan. Numbers chapter 34 verses 1 to 15 describes the land allocated to the Israelite tribes after the Exodus. The tribes of Reuben, Gad and half of Manasseh received land east of the Jordan as explained in Numbers chapter 34 verses 14 to 15. Numbers chapter 34 verses 1 to 13 provides a detailed description of the borders of the land to be conquered west of the Jordan for the remaining tribes. The region is called the land of Canaan in Numbers chapter 34 verse 2, and the borders are known in Jewish tradition as the borders for those coming out of Egypt. These borders are again mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 1 verses 6 to 8, 11:24 and Joshua chapter 1 verse 4. According to the Hebrew Bible, Canaan was the son of Ham who with his descendants had seized the land from the descendants of Shem according to the Book of Jubilees. Jewish tradition thus refers to the region as Canaan during the period between the flood and the Israelite settlement. Eliezer Schweid sees Canaan as a geographical name, and Israel the spiritual name of the land. He writes, The uniqueness of the land of Israel is thus geotheological, and not merely climatic. This is the land which faces the entrance of the spiritual world, that sphere of existence that lies beyond the physical world known to us through our senses. This is the key to the land's unique status with regard to prophecy and prayer, and also with regard to the commandments. Thus, the renaming of this land marks a change in religious status, the origin of the Holy Land concept. Numbers chapter 34 verses 1 to 13 uses the term Canaan strictly for the land west of the Jordan, but land of Israel is used in Jewish tradition to denote the entire land of the Israelites. The English expression, promised land, can denote either the land promised to Abraham in Genesis or the land of Canaan, although the latter meaning is more common. The border with Egypt is given as the Nashal Mitzrayim in Numbers, as well as in Deuteronomy and Ezekiel. Jewish tradition understand this as referring to the Nile, more precisely the Pelusian branch of the Nile Delta according to Halevi, a view supported by Egyptian and Assyrian texts. Saadia Gaon identified it as the Wadi of Owarish, referring to the biblical Sukkot Nephirim. Kafta Vafarach placed it in the same region, which approximates the location of the former Pelusian branch of the Nile. 19th-century Bible commentaries understood the identification as a reference to the Wadi of the coastal locality called Owarish. Easterns, however, notes a local tradition that the course of the river had changed and there was once a branch of the Nile where today there is a wadi. Biblical minimalists have suggested that the Besorah is intended. Deuteronomy chapter 19 verse 8 indicates a certain fluidity of the borders of the Promised Land when it refers to the possibility that God would enlarge your borders. This expansion of territory means that Israel would receive all the land he promised to give to your fathers, which implies that the settlement actually fell short of what was promised. According to Jacob Milgram, Deuteronomy refers to a more utopian map of the Promised Land, whose eastern border is the wilderness rather than the Jordan. Paul R. Williamson notes that a close examination of the relevant promissory texts supports a wider interpretation of the Promised Land, in which it is not restricted absolutely to one geographical locale. He argues that the map of the Promised Land was never seen permanently fixed, but was subject to at least some degree of expansion and redefinition. Ezekiel chapter 47 verses 13 to 20 provides a definition of borders of land in which the 12 tribes of Israel will live during the final redemption, at the end of days. The borders of the land described by the text in Ezekiel include the northern border of modern Lebanon, eastwards to Zedad and Hazarenan in modern Syria, south by southwest to the area of Busra on the Syrian border, follows the Jordan River between the West Bank and the land of Gilead to Tamar on the western shore of the Dead Sea, from Tamar to Meribah Kadesh, then along the Brook of Egypt to the Mediterranean Sea. The territory defined by these borders is divided into 12 strips, one for each of the 12 tribes. Hence, Numbers chapter 34 and Ezekiel chapter 47 define different but similar borders which include the whole of contemporary Lebanon, both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in Israel, except for the South Negev and Eilat. Small parts of Syria are also included. From Dan to Beersheba, the common biblical phrase used to refer to the territories actually settled by the Israelites is, from Dan to Beersheba, which occurs many times in the Bible. It is found in the biblical verses Judges chapter 20 verses 1, 1 Samuel chapter 3 verses 20, 2 Samuel chapter 3 verses 10, 2 Samuel chapter 17 verses 11, 2 Samuel chapter 24 verses 2, 2 Samuel chapter 24 verses 15, 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 25, 1 Chronicles chapter 21 verse 2, and 2 Chronicles chapter 30 verse 5. Division of tribes. The 12 tribes of Israel are divided in 1 Kings chapter 11. In the chapter, King Solomon's sins lead to Israelites forfeiting 10 of the 12 tribes. 30 and Ahir took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. 31 Then he said to Jeroboam, Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. 32 But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe. 33 I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh the god of the Moabites, and Molech the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws as David, Solomon's father, did. 34 But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David my servant, whom I chose and who obeyed my commands and decrees. 35 I will take the kingdom from his son's hands and give you 10 tribes. 36 I will give 1 tribe to his son so that David my servant may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. Kings chapter 1, 1130–1136 Jewish beliefs. Rabbinic laws in the land of Israel according to Menahem Law Babam, in rabbinic tradition. The land of Israel consecrated by the returning exiles was significantly different in its boundaries from both the prescribed biblical borders and the actual borders of the pre-exilic kingdoms. It ranged roughly from Acre in the north to Ashkelon in the south along the Mediterranean, and included Galilee and the Golan. Yet there was no settlement in Samaria. According to Jewish religious law, some laws only apply to Jews living in the land of Israel and some areas in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. These include agricultural laws such as the Shemitah, tithing laws such as the Maser Rishon, Maser Sheni, and Maser Ani, charitable practices during farming, such as PR, and laws regarding taxation. One popular source lists 26 of the 613 mitzvot as contingent upon the land of Israel. Many of the religious laws which applied in ancient times are applied in the modern state of Israel, others have not been revived. Since the State of Israel does not adhere to traditional Jewish law, however, certain parts of the current territory of the State of Israel, such as the Arabah, are considered by some religious authorities to be outside the land of Israel for purposes of Jewish law. According to these authorities, the religious laws do not apply there. According to some Jewish religious authorities, every Jew has an obligation to dwell in the land of Israel and may not leave except for specifically permitted reasons. There are also many laws dealing with how to treat the land. The laws apply to all Jews, and the giving of the land itself in the covenant applies to all Jews, including converts. Inheritance of the promise. Traditional religious Jewish interpretation, and that of most Christian commentators, define Abraham's descendants only as Abraham's seed through his son Isaac and his grandson Jacob. Johann Friedrich Karl Kiel is less clear, as he states that the covenant is through Isaac, but also notes that Ishmael's descendants, generally the Arabs, have held much of that land through time. Modern Jewish debates on the land of Israel. The land of Israel concept has been evoked by the founders of the State of Israel. It often surfaces in political debates on the status of the West Bank, which is referred to in official Israeli discourse as Judea and Samaria, from the names of the two historical Israelite and Judean kingdoms. These debates frequently invoke religious principles, despite the little weight these principles typically carry in Israeli secular politics. Ideas about the need for Jewish control of the land of Israel have been propounded by figures such as Rabbi Yitzhak Ginsburg, who has written about the historical entitlement that Jews have to the whole land of Israel. Ginsburg's ideas about the need for Jewish control over the land has some popularity within contemporary West Bank settlements. However, there are also strong backlashes from the Jewish community regarding these ideas. The Satmar Hasidic community in particular denounces any geographic or political establishment of Israel, deeming this establishment as directly interfering with God's plan for Jewish redemption. Joel Teitelbaum was a foremost figure in this denouncement, calling the land and state of Israel a vehicle for idol worship, as well as a smokescreen for Satan's workings. Divisions within the Jewish community concerning Israel speak to how Israel not only represents an international point of contention, but also a continuous ideological and internal introspection and negotiation specific to the Jewish community and its larger history. Christian beliefs. Inheritance of the promise. During the early 5th century, Saint Augustine of Hippo argued in his City of God that the earthly or carnal kingdom of Israel achieved its peak during the reigns of David and his son Solomon. He goes on to say, however, that this possession was conditional. The Hebrew nation should remain in the same land by the succession of posterity in an unshaken state even to the end of this mortal age, if it obeyed the laws of the Lord its God. He goes on to say that the failure of the Hebrew nation to adhere to this condition resulted in its revocation and the making of a second covenant, and cites Jeremiah chapter 31 verses 31 to 32. Behold, the days come, says the Lord, that I will make for the house of Israel, and for the house of Judah, a new testament, not according to the testament that I settled for their fathers in the day when I laid hold of their hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my testament, and I regarded them not, says the Lord. Augustine concludes that this other promise, revealed in the New Testament, was about to be fulfilled through the incarnation of Christ. I will give my laws in their mind, and will write them upon their hearts, and I will see to them, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. Notwithstanding this doctrine stated by Augustine and also by the Apostle Paul in his epistle to the Romans, the phenomenon of Christian Zionism is widely noted today, especially among evangelical Protestants. Other Protestant groups and churches reject Christian Zionism on various grounds.